The Smithsonian Faculty Fellowship Program represents a rewarding academic professional development opportunity for faculty at Montgomery College. The fellowships are a product of a unique collaboration between Montgomery College and the Smithsonian Center for Learning and Digital Access. It's the first of its kind between the Smithsonian Institution and a community college.
Maria Sprain teaches anthropology on the Rockville campus. A native Washingtonian, she received her PhD and MA degree in anthropology from the University of New Mexico and her BA in anthropology from the George Washington University. Her current research focuses on oral history and Latina culture in Washington, D.C. In 2014, she co-authored a book on Latinos in the area titled Latinos in the Washington Metro Area. She has conducted museum collections-based projects and fieldwork in various locations, including Spain and Mexico. She has also written about and contributed to museum exhibits about Mexico's pre-Columbian Casas Grandes pottery.
Thank you, Mimi. And thank you, everybody, for coming. It's been such a wonderful year. I'm really sad that it's over. So I have a lot to talk about, but I'll only talk about some of the things. So if I leave something out, you can ask me a question afterwards. So I will start, talking about the broadest themes, and as my fellows have already explained, the theme is about being American and understanding that immigrant experience. I wanted to also bring up the mission of the Smithsonian, because we'll come back to that later with some of the student work. But the mission of the Smithsonian is the increase and diffusion of knowledge. And this also is something that we do here at Montgomery College, and it's also one of the goals of the Paul Peck Humanities Institute. I like this quote from a book about museums and communities, and it states that the power of institutions such as the Smithsonian comes in part from their ability to reproduce structures of belief and experience through which cultural differences are understood. And this is something that I try to do in all of my classes, to teach students not only to understand cultural differences, but also to appreciate them. And I think that there is no better place to do that than through this fellowship. So it is challenging to represent American in a museum space. And as I started thinking about the project, obviously my question was, who is American? And how does a museum answer this question with limited space? It's very expensive, and it's often temporary. And the Smithsonian in past years has created particular museums and centers, including the Smithsonian Latino Center, which was created in 1997, the National Museum of African American History and Cultures, and also the National Museum of the American Indian. And that's actually the museum that I chose once again, and I'll explain why. Just briefly, sociocultural anthropology is the study of non-Western peoples, including American Indians. And this really was the foundation of anthropology as a discipline. So it is fitting that I ended up at the Museum of the American Indian once again. I went there for the first fellowship as well. And this course focuses on the study of human society and culture. So really it was quite easy to figure out what to do with the students because there is so much overlap. And so I did choose the National Museum of the American Indian. But then my challenge became, well, how do I relate this to immigration and incorporate it into my class? In the spring of last year, we went to the Museum of the American Indian, and we were able to talk with the director, Kevin Gover, and he gave a really wonderful, wonderful talk about the museum. And just to sum up, one of the points he was making was that of the museum itself is we seek to bring the Native voice into every school, every library, every university, indeed every home. Most Americans will never enter our museum, yet because of the digital revolution in communications, we can reach them all. So the museum is a place for telling stories and critically communicating with the public and storing heritage. So I used this when I came up with my project, and as I was thinking about how to incorporate everything that I had learned through the fellowship. And so I chose the exhibit, the new exhibit, and if you haven't seen it, it's absolutely wonderful. The exhibit is Nation to Nation, Treaties Between the United States and American Indian Nations. Let me just point out here that the exhibit is set up to reflect two different perspectives on history, culture, and society. And this is perfect for an anthropology class that is focused on helping students understand different cultural perspectives. So it was very clear in the exhibit. And as I was thinking about this, I was tasked over the summer through the fellowship to read something and then report on it. And one of the things that I read was Braiding Sweetgrass. And so I was thinking about this concept of what is an immigrant, what is immigration. It's something that changes through time as well. And I was struck by this passage from this book by Robin Wall Kimmerer, who is Potawatomi. She's also a botanist and a mother. And so she writes in her book, "It is good to remember that the original woman was herself an immigrant." And this goes back to this creation myth. And this is something that Lynn brought up with her project as well. So I found a nice connection here. She fell a long way from her home in the sky world, leaving behind all who knew her and who held her dear. She could never go back. Since 1942, most here are immigrants as well, perhaps arriving on Ellis Island without even knowing that Turtle Island rested beneath their feet. And Turtle Island is part of the creation myth. So this all started to come together over the summer, and I realized that this project really met most of the outcomes of this course, Sociocultural Anthropology, which also made it quite easy. So what I then focused on was how to incorporate the museum in the classroom and incorporate the classroom into the museum. And so I ended up doing both in various ways. Here are two of my students. Actually, just one of my students and her friend came. I love it. They always bring relatives and friends. And so they had an assignment to do at the exhibit, Nation to Nation. And what the exhibit did that really highlighted what we were learning in class was that it brought up historical and contemporary issues associated with immigration. But it also brought up a period of history that I don't think any of my students really knew anything about. This is something really surprising to me, but it also gets back to what Kevin Gover talked about when we met with him in the spring. So, clash of cultures, acculturation, assimilation, language loss, cultural loss, conflict over resources, negotiation, activism, political power, resolution, resilience, and there's more, but we were able to deal with all of these issues. And what I loved about being there with the students is that some of these issues are terrible and difficult to deal with, but I was there and we could talk about it. So it was really quite a terrific experience. So we visited the exhibit. They had an assignment at the exhibit, but we also looked at online sources. We looked at transcriptions of the treaties themselves. There are documentaries online that are associated with the exhibit. So I brought the exhibit into the classroom before we even went. And I also used object-based learning in class, which is something that we did a workshop in through the fellowship, which was really very fun. And then I also used, I taught them some methods in sociocultural anthropology, and we did that in the classroom. And I focused on the topic of museums in order to do that. And that really fed into getting them ready for going to the museum. This is something that I also learned throughout the fellowship. So this is what I use for the object-based learning. These images are only about 4 months apart, and these are Chiricahua Apache children who were basically forced to go to the Carlisle Indian School. And this is in Pennsylvania, so it's really not that far. But I gave my students these 2 images and didn't say anything, and I had them use their own brains to kind of figure out what was going on. And they did a very good job. They noticed some things that I didn't notice. And then what I did was I taught them some methods in anthropology. And so one of the methods I taught them is free listing. And free listing, it's kind of like a top 10 list. And you ask people to name or to list something within a domain in order to understand more about it from their perspective. And so I really learned a lot from my students about what they thought about museums, and I'll get to that in a second. So I did the free listing activity with them in class, and I also did a survey with them where they could interview other people, and that was actually very interesting as well. So the free listing was this in-class exercise. They created a top 10 list that describes a cultural domain, and the cultural domain that we explored was the museum. And here are some of my terrific students here interacting at the museum. And so here's the list. So the prompt was think about museums. Off the top of your head, list all the activities that people do in museums. Does this light up? Oh, it does. Okay, so salient score is just a statistical way of creating this top 10 list. And I won't go into all of it, but if you want to know, I'll tell you later. It's really fun. So obviously, I mean, maybe not obviously, but most of the students said look at the exhibits, take photos. Eat was number 3. Shop was number 4. Talk, walk, take a tour, learn, watch movies. And what surprised me was play. There were a lot of things on the list from these students that involved play, including hide and seek, which I thought, oh. So it was a peek into their world and their visits to the museum. And these are some more of my students, and actually one of the students' moms is there as well. They also worked on a questionnaire and interviewed each other, getting prepared for another project in class where they have to conduct interviews. And one of the questions was, what is the purpose of a museum? And so I just pulled some of the quotes from their questionnaires. And these quotes included, to learn something you didn't know before, to educate human beings, to inform the public in a fun way that they will remember for years, to learn about history rather than be confined to a classroom or a textbook, confined, to share the knowledge and history of the rest of the world with us. This is before we went to the museum, by the way. I was preparing them to go, and this is just some of what they had said. In their final papers that related to the museum, I just took out a couple quotes. I asked them about their experience, and the 2 that I liked were, upon leaving the exhibit, I found myself stricken by the complexity of the whole affair. As a child, you were explicitly kept from any mature knowledge, restricted only to Thanksgiving and the culture that the nations exchanged. And what's struck me here is that this quote relates directly to what Kevin Govert taught us at the very first meeting of the fellowship. And here it's coming back to me from a student. So I thought that was really wonderful. And another student said, I do view U.S. history differently now. So that's all for now. I'd like to thank the Paul Peck Humanities Institute, and especially Sarah, Mimi, and Denise, and all of the Smithsonian curators and staff. Zach, thank you so much. And to all my students who really opened my eyes to new things. They showed me things in the exhibit that I had not noticed. So thank you very much.